Good morning, everybody. Hope everybody's doing well. I'm going to be leaving today, but I wanted to get out a video about paragraph 12. I think it's probably the most important thing we need to jump into right now today. And the reason I'm saying that, because on the side that we're seeing, our folks, as well as the people sending offers in from other companies, are still a little confused. I want to make sure we are tracking what right looks like for paragraph 12. There's this flow chart that came out from Texas Realtors. I think it's amazing. If you haven't seen it, please check it out. Please analyze it. Please break it down. Please ask questions. But I think it's really great. And I'm going to pick up from there and show you the combination between the flow chart and our actual system for how to use this to make sure it looks the way it's supposed to. So the first thing about the flow chart, it says in the top left-hand corner, has the seller authorized the listing broker to pay an amount towards the buyer's broker fee in the listing agreement. So obviously, if you're on the buyer side, you're not going to know that. You don't know what happened in the listing presentation. You don't know what the seller authorized. So you have to ask that question. There's a conversation with the listing agent, say, okay, who's paying? Seller paying broker fee or listing broker paying broker fee? So you got to ask that question. What we're finding out is that some of the listing agents are not really clear about that actual answer, but that's where we're at. So just have that conversation. Let's do the easiest one first, okay? If the seller has not authorized the listing broker to pay the other amount to the other broker and says no, then the seller is paying. And if the seller has not agreed to pay the amount and they're saying no, then your buyer is responsible for paying the buyer broker fee according to the buyer rep agreement has. All right. If it's a no across the board, the seller has not authorized the listing broker to pay another broker, the seller is not paying the buyer's broker fee, then your buyer is paying. There's nothing other than what's in the buyer representation agreement. You would be looking at your buyer to pay that, right? That's the first part. Now let's look at if some of these answers are yes. If the seller has authorized the listing broker to pay that amount towards the broker fee, what would happen first? And I'm going to pull this up so you can see. So I'm going to go over to a list agreement I have, representation documents, exclusive right to sell. Click on that. In this agreement, 5A would look something like this. 5 apples, 6 apples, 7 apples, whatever you have. The seller will pay the broker, listing broker, insert total amount from broker and other broker. In this case, it was 5% checked off, right? And also, I charge it, I charge a $450 transaction fee. That's in there as well. And then section 2, 5A2, it says if the other broker procures a buyer that purchased the property, seller authorized the broker to pay the other broker the following amount, which is 2.5%. So that's what's happening there, right? And it also goes on and says, okay, seller authorized the broker to publicly disclose compensations that other brokers specified in 5A2. So you have the right to sit there and tell other brokers that this is what the seller is considering up to pay, right? Now, I do want to throw this in there because it's getting kind of confusing, all right, a little bit. We just had a situation recently about this. In 5.4, it says broker will retain amount specified in 5A1 as a broker fee if no other broker procures the buyer, including transactions where the broker represents both seller and buyer and intermediary, or the buyer is unrepresented. Amount specified in 5A2A will be applied towards any fees a buyer has agreed to pay the broker as specified in a separate written agreement, which is a buyer rep agreement. So meaning that if there's if the buyer is unrepresented, then whatever amount here in 5A1, it still applies to the seller. You need to make sure you tell the seller that. So if the buyer's unrepresented, cool. You still owe 5%, right, Mr. Seller, right? And if there's no other broker, then the seller's still on the hook to pay the 5%. That's what that means. So when you're out doing your listing appointments, make sure you're explaining it the right way. We just had a situation where a seller felt like, hey, I don't owe that because they found the buyer and all this other mess. And they was like, okay, well, that's not what I signed. Well, that's not true. You did sign that if there was no other broker involved or unrepresented broker, that you, Mr. Seller, still would pay whatever amount in 5A1. Make sure you're doing a good job explaining that, because it's really kind of confusing sometimes with the seller. And you have to explain that, right? That's something you need to explain. Let's get off that one for a second. So in that case, we're going to go back to the flow chart. And it says, okay, listing broker pays the buyer's broker. If that is the case, the listing broker is paying the buyer broker, two things has to happen. We have to have that compensation agreement between brokers, 2402, and the amount being paid by the listing broker will be completed in page 10 of the sales contract, right? So in a case like this, I'm going to try and see if I can find something real quick here. Let's pick this deal. Let's go here. Let me pick this one. I hope it's right, but we're going to put it together. Let's go to offer docs. So you can see I have the compensation between brokers, because in this case, the listing broker was authorized to pay the buyer broker, which is me, right? And in the contract itself, on paragraph 12, we negotiated 3%. It changed from 2.5% to 3%, right? And it should have been reflected down in paragraph 10 of the 3% there, right? You can see where we removed it out of here. All right. I initially put the contract in that for 2.5 to be paid by the seller. We wiped that out because it wasn't being paid by the seller. It was going to be paid by the listing broker. And then down here, we put in the 3% being paid from the listing broker, right? That was all during the negotiations. The initial conversation with the listing broker, listing agent, he thought that the seller was paying, but once we got into some conversation, we really dug into it. It's not the seller, it's the listing broker. So we made the change, and therefore we didn't have to have anything in paragraph 12 up here. We removed that, which is fine. So that's the right way to do it. Remove that and reflect it in section 10. Okay, that's the way that's supposed to look. All right, let's go to a different one. Let's go to Fiesta here. Let's go to offer documents on Fiesta, and let's paint it the other way. Now we're back to the flow chart. You saw that, look, we had the conversation about compensation between brokers here. And then we removed it out of 12A1B, right? We removed that amount out of there, but we did use it in page 10. Okay, we put the 3% in page 10 and we removed it from 12A1B. So we removed it. That's the way that's supposed to work. Now, let's go to a different scenario. The seller has not authorized the listing broker to pay amount towards the buyer's broker, and the seller has agreed to pay an amount. This is yes. We're going down. Seller pays buyer broker directly. Well, this is when we would complete paragraph 12A1B in the sales contract. We will put that 3% there, right? And we do not have to use the 2402 or complete paragraph 10. Let's go to this one. In this case, the seller is agreeing to pay. Let me make sure they're right. Confirm. In financial terms, when we go down to what amount the seller contributed buyer's broker fee? We will put 3% there, right? Right. Now we're going to put it in 12A1B. That's where it's going to be at. Closing costs is totally different, right? That's going to be specified. Has a listing broker agreed to pay, but we don't need that. We'll hit save. I will go down to broker information. Make sure that's all right. Everything's good. All right. And come down here and jointly should have spitted out the correct paragraph. If you go down to 12A1, now since the seller is paying it, then in paragraph page 10 does not need to be filled out with the 3% because the seller is paying, not the listing broker, right? So let's go back over here. And that's what that is talking about. Now, let's jump over here and let's say, okay, well, let's give a couple scenarios. So let's say the first scenario would be that you had 3% that the buyer was going to pay you on the representation agreement, right? However, you only negotiated for the listing broker or the seller to pay you 2.5%, right? So that 0.5% should go in the CDA. The buyer broker should submit a CDA to title to disclose the amount of compensation the buyer is paying the buyer's broker that has not been covered by either the seller or the listing broker. That's how you would annotate that because the listing agreement, the buyer representation agreement already specified that you was authorized 3%. And let's say that you only got between the listing broker and the seller a total of 2.5%. Well, there's a 0.5 difference, so you would make that 0.5 differences up on the CDA. So make sure you understand that. Now, if it was the other way around, saying you was only authorized 2.5% on the buyer rep agreement, right? And they're paying out 3%. Well, this is where we've learned you need to change or amend the buyer representation agreement to what you're being paid. And you have to get your buyer to authorize that on the form. You got to get that amended and the buyer has to sign the amendment, right? So that's the way that looks. So the couple of different scenarios there, right? Now, let's say that if the amount the listing broker is paying the buyer's broker is not enough to cover the entire broker's fee, okay? The seller may agree to pay an additional amount directly to the buyer's broker. In this scenario, a portion of the buyer's broker fee will be paid by the listing broker using the compensation agreement between brokers, the 2402, and a portion would be paid by the seller in paragraph 12A 1B of the sales contract. So you could have a combination of both. Let's say the seller's paying 2% and the listing broker's paying 1%. You could use both of those paragraphs, or both of those, the 2402 and the paragraph 12A1B, to reflect what's being paid. And it's going to be paid out on the CDA the same way. So that's another thing to look at as well. And I would imagine on that particular scenario, now we're using 12A1B to reflect the 2%. And then in section, well, page 10, right, there will be 1% coming from the listing broker. So the combination would work there, right? That's the scenario where the combination would work. So keep that in mind as well. This paragraph, I know it's our transition period. People are still trying to figure it out. Just yesterday, I called the Texas Realtors hotline to really clarify some things. But I think as we grow, as we learn, we're getting better at this. And I think people should know that as well. I want to bring one more thing to your attention. This is huge, right? Let's go back to a different situation. Another thing I think we need to really reflect on. I'm going to my representation documents. I have the exclusive right to sell. You just saw paragraph A, right? Now I also have the seller's authorization to disclose information. This authorizes me to disclose what amount the seller is considering to pay towards buyer's expenses. We need this because this gives me the authorization to let everybody know that, hey, my seller is considering to contribute towards buyer's expenses up to this amount. In this case, it's $14,310. This can be used for the buyer to do as they choose. It could be for buyer's agent compensation. It could be for that. It could be for closing costs. It could be for buyer rate buy down. It could be for whatever, right? But it's towards buyer expenses, whatever buyer expenses they have. Now in the MLS, because I have that, our MLS has authorized us. Not every MLS has that. This is something I did as the president of the MLS to make sure we had this ability to do that, to publicly display and disclose what the seller is going to pay or consider paying towards buyer's expenses. In my case, you can see this in public remarks. I'm going to blow this up so everybody see it. Let's go a little bit bigger. So in public remarks on my listing, you can come down to my public remarks and you can see seller is offering up to $14,310 towards buyer's expenses. Make sure the verbiage that you use for that is for buyer's expenses. Do not put anything other than that. I'm still getting questions from seasoned vets asking me, is that authorized? I'm like, yeah, it is authorized. We put a whole thing out about this last year about, hey, you can use that verbiage towards buyer expenses. You can't use the word bonus. You can't use the word commission. You can't use anything towards buyer's agent compensation, but you can use it towards buyer expenses. Please know the difference. There's a difference between buyer expenses versus anything towards a buyer's agent. So that's what we really need to make sure we understand. Now that I have that, I can display this anywhere I want, even in the MLS, the right way. So just keep that in mind, guys. It's one of those things that we need to make sure we understand. It makes you better in this negotiation process. I hope this helps. Have a great weekend. All right. Peace.